It was Christmas Eve, 2019, in one of London's most affluent neighbourhoods, Battersea. The streets were quiet, the air cold, and homes lit with festive warmth. Families were gathered around trees, children tucked into bed, stockings waiting to be filled. But on one quiet street, something unthinkable was about to happen. At around 9 p.m, a 36-year-old man named Flamur Beqiri was walking towards his front door. His wife and young child were already inside the house. What he didn't know was that a hitman, cold, calculated, and patient, was waiting for him in the shadows. Within seconds, Beqiri was gunned down in a hail of bullets. He was shot 10 times, execution style, just steps away from his family. The gunman fled the scene almost instantly, leaving behind a trail of fear, questions, and mystery. At first glance, it looks like a deeply personal killing, but the more detectives uncovered, the clearer it became. This wasn't just personal, it was transnational. Beqiri's murder would lead investigators deep into the world of European organised crime, stretching from Sweden to Albania, from the streets of Malmö to the heart of London. What emerged was a chilling narrative of drugs, power, revenge, and a life lived in the shadows of criminal empires. So who was Flamur Beqiri, and why was he targeted? What did his death reveal about the brutal, hidden wars between crime syndicates operating across Europe? To the casual observer, Flamur Beqiri appeared to be the picture of success. Living in a £1.5 million townhouse on a quiet street in Battersea in London, he was known locally as a quiet, well-dressed man with a young family. He had recently married Deba Krasniqi, a Swedish-Albanian reality TV personality who had appeared on the Swedish edition of Real Housewives. Together they had a toddler son and were building what many would call a dream life, one filled with luxury, status, and privacy. But that was only one version of Flamur's story. The other version, the one whispered in police reports, tracked in intelligence files, and feared across Europe, painted a very different picture. Born in 1983 in Albania, Flamur Beqiri emigrated to Sweden at a young age. He grew up in Malmö, a city known for its vibrant immigrant communities, but also for its rising reputation as a hotbed for organised crime. In his early years, Beqiri appeared to pursue a legitimate path. He developed a passion for music and later established himself in the entertainment industry. He founded Gramophone Records, a music production and artist management company. But behind that respectable facade, Swedish authorities believed Beqiri was connected to some of the country's most dangerous criminal syndicates, including those deeply entrenched in international drug trafficking operations. In fact, Swedish police had long kept tabs on Beqiri. His name appeared in multiple investigations relating to narcotics, firearms, and organised crime. At one point, he was listed as a suspect in a major drug importation case, but was never formally charged. In 2016, he left Sweden, allegedly due to increasing threats against his life. By the time he arrived in the UK, he had reinvented himself. He described himself on official documents as a music executive, distancing himself from any past associations. His business records in London were clean, but investigators would later believe that his move to the UK wasn't just a fresh start. It was a strategic relocation, part of a wider network of criminal figures shifting operations across borders. Whether Flamur Beqiri was truly trying to escape his past or simply hiding it better remains unclear. But one thing is certain, he was no ordinary victim, and the people who wanted him dead weren't amateurs. They were professionals, and they were patient. By the time Flamur Beqiri was murdered in 2019, authorities across Europe had long suspected he wasn't just a music executive. They believed he was part of a sprawling criminal network, one that crossed borders, moved massive quantities of drugs, and killed without hesitation. The roots of this network went back to Sweden, where Beqiri was linked to members of the Swedish-Albanian organised crime groups, particularly those operating out of Malmö, Stockholm, and Gothenburg. According to law enforcement sources, these syndicates had forged powerful alliances with counterparts in Albania, Kosovo, and the Western Balkans. They sourced cocaine and cannabis from Latin America and the Mediterranean before distributing it across Northern and Western Europe. Beqiri was reportedly connected to a network that operated like a business empire, but one driven by violence, intimidation, and a strict code of silence. There were no official records tying him to these activities. He was never convicted, but investigators believed he played a significant role behind the scenes, helping to facilitate shipments, manage finances, and perhaps even smooth relations between rival factions. What made this network particularly dangerous was the blurring of lines between business and blood feuds. In organized crime, loyalties can shift. Deals go wrong, alliances break, and once a line is crossed, there's no turning back. British police, working alongside Europol and Swedish authorities, examined messages and surveillance footage that pointed to a carefully planned assassination, one carried out on behalf of rivals. This wasn't just about one man. This was a story of a violent criminal enterprise, cold, calculated, and corporate. The people Flamur Beqiri was involved with weren't petty criminals. They were organizers with international connections, military-grade weapons, and surveillance networks that rivaled law enforcement. In the end, it appeared Flamur had run out of protection, and the people who wanted him dead didn't leave any room for negotiation. It was December the 24th, 2019, on a quiet residential street in Battersea Church Road, one of London's more affluent and peaceful neighbourhoods. Most homes were aglow with holiday lights. Families were preparing for Christmas, children were asleep, the streets were calm. But a few minutes past 9 p.m, that silence was shattered. Flamur Beqiri had just returned home. He was just steps from his front door. His wife, Deborah Krasnicki, and their young child were already inside. As he walked towards the entrance of their £1.5 million townhouse, a figure emerged from the shadows. In an instant, 10 shots rang out. Beqiri collapsed, shot in the head, chest, and back. The gunman fled the scene silently and swiftly, without hesitation, without leaving a trace of his identity behind. It was a cold-blooded execution, one that bore all the masks of a professional contract killing. But what made it even more disturbing was how meticulously it had been planned, and who had carried it out. The man who murdered Flamur Beqiri would later be identified as Anis Fahoud Hemisi, a Swedish national born in 1991 and a former professional Muay Thai fighter. He had been known in Sweden's martial arts circles for years and had a reputation for precision, control, and discipline, traits that would later define his actions as a killer. Hemisi was affiliated with the Swedish-Albanian organised crime networks, particularly those operating out of Malmö, where Beqiri had lived before relocating to the UK. He was recruited for the hit and travelled to the UK specifically to assassinate Beqiri, arriving in London in early December 2019 under a false identity. For nearly 2 weeks, Hemisi carried out extensive surveillance on Beqiri's home. He didn't use digital tools or drones. He used disguises and blended into the neighbourhood in person. At various points during his surveillance, Hemisi dressed as an elderly man, wearing a long coat, a flat cap, and faking a limp. He also disguised himself as a street cleaner, equipped with a high-visibility vest and a litter-picking tool, or sometimes as a casual pedestrian using a lady's bicycle, which he would use to move silently and swiftly through local roads and alleyways. The lady's bicycle would later become a critical piece of information in the investigation. The bicycle, a distinctive light-coloured lady's bicycle, was a deliberate choice. It allowed him to move undetected, across narrow spaces, and avoid the kind of license plate recognition system that might track a car. He was regularly captured on CCTV travelling around Battersea Church Road and surrounding areas, always dressed differently, never drawing attention. On Christmas Eve, Hemisi returned to the neighbourhood, this time to carry out the killing. Shortly after 9 p.m, as Beqiri returned home, Hemisi approached him near the front door and fired 10 rounds from a 9mm semi-automatic pistol, striking him in the head, chest, and body. Beqiri died instantly, and his wife found him moments later. Hemisi then fled the scene using the lady's bicycle, disappearing into the streets of South London. He had pre-planned his escape route, using quieter roads and paths to avoid traffic and surveillance. Within 48 hours, he had fled the UK, making his way back to Europe through commercial travel routes. This was not a crime of passion, it was not a robbery. nothing was taken, no confrontation occurred. It was a planned assassination, carried out with military-style precision. The choice of time, Christmas Eve, was no accident. It was symbolic. It ensured Beqiri would be off guard, with his defences down, and it sent a brutal message to others in the criminal underworld. Investigators would later find that Hemisi had rented a flat in southwest London, stayed for just long enough to monitor Beqiri's movements, and then disappeared. Every detail, from clothing to transportation to escape, had been thought through in advance. The fact that Hemisi could enter the UK, execute a killing with this level of preparation, and vanish within 48 hours tells us one thing. This wasn't a one-off. This was a system. And Beqiri wasn't just a man with enemies. He was a man with powerful enemies who were willing to invest time, money, and a trained assassin to take him out. From the moment Flamur Beqiri was shot dead on Christmas Eve 2019, detectives from the Metropolitan Police's Specialist Crime Command knew that they were not dealing with a random act of violence. This was an assassination, precise, targeted, and planned. But the killer had vanished into the night. No witnesses could identify him, no weapon was recovered, there was no immediate suspect. Still, police had one powerful tool: CCTV. Within days, detectives launched an exhaustive sweep of CCTV footage across Battersea and neighbouring boroughs. The breakthrough came not from footage of the murder itself, but from the days leading up to it. Investigators identified a man cycling around the area on a distinctive lady's bicycle, dressed in a variety of disguises. As I mentioned previously, on some days he posed as an elderly man with a limp, wearing a flat cap and overcoat, while on others, he appeared as a council litter picker, donning a high-visibility vest and pushing a trolley. He constantly used a light-coloured lady's bike, chosen specifically because it was discreet and inconspicuous. The bike gave him mobility, allowed him to slip through side streets, and attracted no suspicion. His behaviour showed an almost surgeon-like attention to detail, methodically circling the area, avoiding cameras, and never using the same disguise twice in a row. However, the bicycle used by Hemisi played a more significant role in the investigation than it might first appear. In Sweden, this type of bicycle is a common and practical choice, widely used by both men and women for short-distance travel. It's associated with everyday commuting, particularly in urban areas like Malmö, where Hemisi was from. However, in the UK, and particularly in London, such bicycles are less commonly used by men and tend to be seen more as leisure or casual use bikes, often ridden by women. The specific model Hemisi used was light in colour and visually distinctive, which made it easy to track across multiple CCTV cameras. Hemisi's plan was to use a non-threatening and nondescript vehicle that wouldn't draw attention while navigating through the side streets and alleys, something a car couldn't do without triggering automatic number plate recognition systems. But ironically, his familiarity with this type of bicycle from Sweden ended up working against him in London. Surveillance teams noticed that a man using this particular bike, in various disguises, appeared repeatedly around the same area in the days leading up to the murder. A pattern that became a crucial lead in identifying him. This surveillance footage was the first clue that this was a contract killing, carried out by a professional operative. Through the analysis of airline passenger data, travel records, and DNA evidence left behind in the short-term rental flat he had occupied, the suspect was eventually identified as Anis Fahoud Hemisi, a Swedish national. Following the murder, Hemisi left the UK within 48 hours, flying first to Portugal, then to Denmark, where he believed he would be beyond the reach of the British authorities. But thanks to coordination between the Met Police, Europol, Swedish police, and the Danish authorities, Hemisi was tracked to a gym in Copenhagen. On January the 20th of 2020, less than a month after the murder, Hemisi was arrested by armed officers. A European arrest warrant was issued, and following legal proceedings in Denmark, he was extradited to the UK to face trial. What police uncovered was deeply unsettling. Hemisi was not just a criminal. He was a professional Muay Thai fighter, well known in Swedish sporting circles. He had a background in violence, but more importantly, he had the discipline, mental focus, and calm execution associated with trained assassins. He was linked to organised crime groups in Malmö, some of which had a long-standing presence in Swedish-Albanian drug trafficking. The murder of Flamur Beqiri was a carefully orchestrated plot, designed and executed by members of a transnational criminal network. By the time police had arrested Amissi, the Swedish national who pulled the trigger, it had become clear he was acting as part of a broader conspiracy involving other international players. The level of planning, surveillance, and coordination required could not have been achieved by one man alone. One of the most significant figures to emerge during the investigation was Estevan Alexis Pino Munizaga. Pino Munizaga, a Swedish-Chilean national with ties to organised crime circles in Malmö, the same city where Beqiri had once lived. Pino Munizaga played a vital logistical and intelligence-gathering role in the weeks leading up to the killing. He arrived in the UK prior to her Amissi, conducted covert surveillance on Beqiri's home in Battersea, and gathered information on Beqiri's movements, routine, and family. He took photographs of the property, scoped out possible escape routes, and relayed intelligence back to the group. In many ways, he was the eyes and ears of the operation before the hitman ever landed on British soil. When Amissi arrived, Pino Munizaga helped guide him, providing vital support for the murder to be carried out swiftly and efficiently. Their communications were frequent and discreet, encrypted and coded to avoid detection. The investigation revealed that members of the conspiracy had used encrypted messaging platforms such as EncroChat to coordinate their activities. Through these communications, Amissi received instructions, addresses, photographs, and even details about Beqiri's security routines. The messages painted a clear picture. This was a murder ordered from abroad, with planning taking place across Sweden and the UK, supported by surveillance on the ground in London. The precision of the operation, from arrival logistics and disguise preparation to transport and getaway planning, indicated military-level coordination. Amissi was deployed like a contractor, with detailed instruction and a full support structure behind him. To this day, the individual or group who ordered the killing has not been publicly identified, but evidence suggests it stemmed from a violent dispute between rival organised crime groups operating out of Sweden and Albania. Beqiri had long-standing alleged ties to Swedish-Albanian organised crime, particularly in Malmö, where a wave of gang violence had claimed multiple lives. It's believed that his murder may have been retaliation or part of a wider criminal score setting, possibly related to drug trafficking operations that spanned across Europe. Despite moving to the UK and presenting himself as a legitimate businessman in the music industry, Beqiri remained a person of interest to Swedish law enforcement, and it's clear that his past connections eventually caught up with him, even across borders. Through a combination of encrypted communications, airline records, CCTV footage, phone and travel data, intelligence from Europol and Swedish authorities, British investigators built an airtight case against Amissi and Pino Munizaga. The surveillance, the travel, the safe houses, the photos of the target, every detail demonstrated premeditation and conspiracy. This wasn't chaotic or opportunistic. It was structured, calculated, and disturbingly professional. The assassination of Flamur Beqiri wasn't just a personal vendetta or an isolated act of violence. It was the product of something far more dangerous. A transnational underworld conflict rooted in drugs, power, and control. To understand why Beqiri was murdered, we must look beyond London, to Malmö in Sweden, where Beqiri once lived, and where a brutal, years-long gang war had left a trail of bodies, bullets, and unsolved murders. In the 2010s, Malmö became a hotspot for organised crimes, particularly among Swedish-Albanian criminal syndicates. These groups were involved in importing large quantities of cocaine and cannabis, controlling distribution routes across Scandinavia and Northern Europe, and carrying out contract killings to settle disputes or enforce silence. Malmö's violence escalated, with shootings in residential neighbourhoods and even near schools. Police were hampered by a lack of coordination from witnesses and the professionalism of the perpetrators. Beqiri, who had grown up in Malmö and reportedly maintained ties to criminal figures there, was believed by authorities to have remained in some capacity, possibly financially entangled, or still in contact with old associates. His relocation to the UK was seen not necessarily as an escape, but perhaps a repositioning, and eventually it wasn't far enough. The groups operating in Malmö weren't working in isolation. They were connected to larger Balkan networks spanning Albania, Kosovo, and parts of the Netherlands and Germany. These alliances were based on shared ethnicity, family ties, and above all, money. They trafficked drugs, laundered money, smuggled weapons, and eliminated rivals through cold, strategic violence. Europol and other law enforcement bodies believe Beqiri's murder was likely part of a wider campaign of retaliation linked to failed deals, missing money, or internal betrayal. No mastermind has ever been publicly named, but the belief remains this hit was commissioned from above, from someone or a group with reach, power, and reason. Beqiri's case wasn't unique. In the years surrounding his murder, there was a sharp increase in contract killings involving Balkan and Nordic groups. There was growing use of encrypted communications like EncroChat and Sky ECC. There was an uptick in cross-border assassinations, often involving travel across multiple EU states, and a blending of criminal and legitimate enterprises, especially in industries like nightlife, real estate, and entertainment. This is the face of modern organized crime in Europe, structured like a business, deadly like a war. And as the murder of Flamur Beqiri proved, borderlines don't offer protection, connections do, and once they're broken, you become expendable. The successful arrests and convictions of Hamisi and Pino Munizaga were viewed as a significant achievement for British and European law enforcement. But behind closed doors, the case also highlighted how vulnerable national borders are to professional hit squads. By the time Hamisi and Pino Munizaga stood trial, British prosecutors had spent nearly 2 years piecing together one of the most complex and far-reaching murder investigations in recent memory. The evidence against them was overwhelming. A blend of painstaking forensic work, international cooperation, encrypted communications, and CCTV surveillance. The trial began at Southwark Crown Court in late 2021 and captured public and media attention across the UK and Sweden. Despite the heavy weight of evidence, both men pleaded not guilty, forcing the prosecution to lay out every chilling detail before a jury. Hamisi faced multiple charges, including murder, manslaughter as the alternative, and possession of a firearm with intent to endanger life. Prosecutors showed the jury footage of Hamisi in the days before the killing, dressed in various disguises, cycling through Battersea on his distinctive lady's bicycle. They matched his movements, costumes, and behaviour to the night of the murder. DNA evidence recovered from latex gloves and clothing in a flat provided forensic proof linking Hamisi to the scene. Travel records confirmed that Hamisi had entered the UK using a false identity shortly before the murder and fled through Portugal to Denmark within 48 hours of the shooting. The prosecution underlined Hamisi's background as a trained Muay Thai fighter, arguing that his physical discipline and precision were exactly why he had been chosen for the hit. After weeks of testimony, the jury found Hamisi guilty of murder. In early 2022, he was sentenced to life imprisonment, with a minimum term of 35 years before he can be considered for parole. While Hamisi had pulled the trigger, the role of Pino Munizaga was equally critical to the plot. He was charged with manslaughter and conspiracy to murder, which was initially considered, but ultimately the prosecution proceeded on the manslaughter charge. Evidence was presented to show that Pino Munizaga had travelled to London weeks before the shooting, conducted reconnaissance on Beqiri's home, and gathered surveillance photographs, essential intelligence passed to Hamisi and other conspirators. CCTV captured him near Beqiri's property, and digital forensics uncovered encrypted chats that mapped out Beqiri's routine. Although he was not the man who fired the gun, the court heard that Pino Munizaga's role was indispensable. Without his groundwork, the murder could not have been executed so precisely. The jury found him guilty of manslaughter, and he was sentenced to 15 years in prison. During sentencing, the judge did not mince words. He described the murder of Flamur Beqiri as an execution planned with chilling ruthlessness, noting that it was designed not just to kill, but to terrorize. A hit timed to Christmas Eve, outside a family home, in full view of loved ones. The judge stated plainly that this was the work of professional killers, operating as part of an international organized crime network, and that society had to send a strong message that such acts would not go unanswered. The trial and convictions delivered justice for Flamur Beqiri's family, but only partly. While Hemisi and Pino Munizaga were held accountable, the bigger players, those who ordered the assassination, remain unknown and untouched. The courtroom provided some closure, but the hidden war between European criminal syndicates, the one that cost Flamur Beqiri his life, continues beyond the walls of any court. This wasn't just the story of Flamur Beqiri, it was the story of a silent war fought across Europe, in the shadows most of us never see. It was a murder that crossed borders, carried out by professionals, and still surrounded by unanswered questions. If this case moved you, unsettled you, or made you think, please like, comment, and subscribe to the Silent Casebook for more true crime stories that go beyond the headlines and into the hidden truths.